The Japanese captain boasted, "You'll never find us in this fog." U.S. radar exposed everything. On November 24th, 1943, the Solomon Sea was covered by a dense wall of fog that had formed hours earlier and showed no signs of lifting. The water was calm, and the night air carried a steady cold that wrapped around every surface it touched. Visibility was nearly zero. A person standing on the deck of any ship could barely see more than a few steps ahead. It was the kind of weather that forced sailors to rely on instinct, training, and the sound of engines rather than eyesight. A Japanese destroyer, Shiritsu, moved carefully through this fog at a controlled pace. On its bridge stood Captain Hiroshi Nakagawa, a 43-year-old officer who had served in the Imperial Navy since before the war with China. He had spent most of his career training in night fighting tactics, a field in which Japan had once held an overwhelming advantage. His superiors valued his calm demeanor under pressure and his strict adherence to doctrine. His task tonight was straightforward: escort 3 transports carrying essential supplies to a forward outpost and return without being detected by American forces. The fog seemed to guarantee that outcome. Nakagawa kept his posture rigid as he studied the chart table. His duty was to lead the formation, maintain course, and ensure the transport stayed within safe distance behind his destroyer. Every few minutes he asked for speed, bearing, and distance updates. He relied on dead reckoning and the limited readings the crew could gather in these conditions. Japanese destroyers at this point in the war carried no reliable radar of their own, leaving officers like Nakagawa dependent on experience. Near him stood Lieutenant Riku Sato, the ship's navigation officer. Sato was 29, younger and less confident than his captain, but meticulous in his record-keeping. He came from a technical background and had been assigned to destroyers because of his ability to calculate drift and course adjustments quickly during night operations. His job was to maintain their position on the chart and monitor for signs they were drifting too close to reefs or enemy patrol zones. The fog complicated everything he did. Each mark of the pencil felt uncertain, yet he followed his captain's orders without argument. Below deck, sailors moved quietly through tightly confined corridors. Torpedo operators checked launch mechanisms by touch. Engine room crew monitored temperature gauges and pressure valves. The destroyer's interior was warm and humid in contrast to the cold air above. Everything smelled of oil, metal, and sweat. On the American side of the fog, a destroyer called USS Farragut was also moving steadily through the night. Aboard her was Lieutenant Commander Daniel Rourke, 28 years old, assigned as the ship's radar officer. He had joined the Navy just before the war and had spent much of his early service learning the technical details of the newly introduced SG radar sets. He believed strongly in their potential, even before many senior officers trusted them. His role tonight was to interpret radar data, identify enemy formations, and guide the ship's movements during operations where visibility was limited. Radar made him essential, especially in weather like this. Working beside him in the Combat Information Center was Ensign Walter Briggs, a 22-year-old radar operator fresh from stateside training. Briggs lacked combat experience, but was quick with the equipment and had sharp visual focus. His task was to maintain constant sweeps, adjust gain and clarity, and track any returns that appeared on the scope. Operators like him were becoming the eyes of the fleet in conditions that made traditional observation impossible. Unbeknownst to Captain Nakagawa, the Americans had already picked up vague reports of Japanese movements earlier in the evening. The Farragut had been ordered to investigate. The fog that Nakagawa believed was an impenetrable shield was the very condition that gave Rourke's radar its greatest advantage. The worse the visibility, the more decisive the SG system became. Rourke understood this, and he intended to use it. Back aboard the Shiratu, Sato quietly approached his captain and raised the concern he had been trying to suppress for the past hour. He mentioned the intelligence reports they had received about American radar capabilities. He explained that several Japanese ships in recent months had suffered surprise engagements at night despite operating under heavy cloud cover. His tone was careful, respectful, but firm. Nakagawa dismissed the concern immediately. He believed the stories were exaggerated, or that the ships involved had made navigational mistakes. He trusted the fog. He trusted his training. He trusted the Imperial Navy's decades of doctrine asserting that night and low visibility were Japanese advantages. Fog, to him, did not represent danger. It represented protection. He stepped out onto the bridge wing, looked into the white void surrounding the ship, and stated that the Americans would never find them in conditions like this. Officers nearby acknowledged his confidence without comment, although several of them shared Sato's private unease. The formation continued forward. The transports kept close behind the destroyer, each relying on the faint sound of Nakagawa's screws to guide their movement. The sea was quiet. No searchlights cut through the fog. No silhouettes appeared. For the Japanese crews, it felt like an uncomplicated night operation in territory they understood. But 40 miles to the east, Daniel Rourke was already watching faint returns on the radar scope. Walter Briggs monitored them carefully, adjusting the controls, confirming that the shapes represented multiple ships moving together. Their destroyer adjusted course to intercept. The CIC below deck hummed with quiet urgency, while the bridge above saw nothing but darkness. The two forces were moving toward a confrontation neither side could see with the naked eye. One side believed the fog ensured safety. The other side had learned to see through it. And the events that were about to unfold would determine who truly understood the future of naval warfare. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Farragut, the atmosphere was tense but controlled. The room had no windows, only dim red lights and the steady hum of electrical equipment. Operators spoke in low voices to avoid distracting one another. Every man present understood that in fog this dense, their destroyer was functionally blind without the radar systems glowing softly in the center of the room. Ensign Walter Briggs sat at the SG radar console with his headphones over his ears, listening to faint static while watching the circular sweep line rotate across the screen. He had been trained to recognize the difference between clutter, sea return, and the sharp edges of a ship-size contact. His instructors had warned him that the first real test would come without warning, under conditions that offered no guidance except the skill of the operator. Tonight was exactly that. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Rourke stood behind him, leaning forward to observe each sweep. Rourke had developed a habit of watching the radar without blinking during moments like this, as if breaking eye contact for even 1 second might cause something important to vanish. He carried a notebook filled with range calculations, signal strength readings, and past contact patterns, all of which he used to interpret returns more quickly than most officers in the theater. His responsibility was not only to confirm what Briggs saw, but to translate that information into immediate tactical decisions for the ship's captain. Briggs adjusted the gain slightly and froze. A shape appeared on the screen, faint but sharper than the static. He did not speak immediately. He waited for a second sweep to confirm. When the rotating line passed again, the blip remained. By the fourth sweep, more shapes appeared surrounding the first one. "Sir," Briggs said quietly, "I've got multiple contacts at 38,000 yards. Bearing 070. Rourke stepped closer and watched the return stabilize. He knew at once these were not rain squalls or small fishing boats. The spacing was too consistent. The movement was too steady. It was a formation. He asked for the range again, and Briggs gave it without hesitation. Rourke lifted the intercom microphone to his mouth. "Bridge combat. We have confirmed radar contacts. Multiple ships. Range 38,000 yards. Bearing 070. The reply came after several seconds of silence, the voice from the bridge sounding doubtful. The captain asked if the radar was functioning properly in such heavy fog. Rourke glanced at Briggs, who nodded firmly. The SG set was operating as cleanly as they could hope for. Rourke responded without hesitation. "Contacts are solid. They're maintaining constant bearing and speed." The bridge acknowledged, though the tone carried a hint of disbelief. Fog this thick had never been friendly to surface warfare. It created confusion, uncertainty, and room for error. To trust a glowing screen more than experienced lookouts felt unnatural to many officers. Rourke returned his focus to the radar. Briggs tracked the formation's movement, adjusting settings to refine the picture. Each new sweep gave more detail. The lead contact appeared longer than the others, likely a destroyer. The smaller shapes behind it were almost certainly transports or cargo vessels. The formation size and spacing matched prior Japanese movements through the region. Briggs' pulse quickened as he called out a slight course correction from the enemy. "Sir, they're adjusting bearing 5 degrees to port." Rourke wrote down the change. He compared it to their presumed track and understood instantly what was happening. They're zigzagging. They think someone might be tracking them. The irony was clear. The Japanese formation believed the fog was eliminating all chances of detection. Instead, it was giving the Americans the cleanest radar conditions possible. No starlight, no background clutter, no competing visual signals. The enemy formation moved like shadows across a blank canvas. The SG system picked them up effortlessly. Rourke updated the bridge again. This time the tone that came back had shifted. Doubt was fading. Orders were given for the Farragut to increase speed and adjust course to intercept. The ship responded immediately. The deck under Rourke's boots vibrated more intensely as the engines pushed harder. The crew felt the shift, but only those in the CIC knew exactly why the destroyer had changed posture so suddenly. Briggs continued tracking the blips. He gave updates every few seconds, small changes in bearing, speed, and course. Rourke compared each update to the calculations in his notebook. The two men worked with a rhythm that had formed only in the last weeks at sea, but it functioned with the precision of a veteran team. The CIC crew around them monitored their stations quietly, aware that each detail mattered. 30 minutes passed. The distance closed steadily. The radar picture grew clearer. Rourke leaned over Briggs' shoulder once more. He could now distinguish the positions of the smaller ships with greater accuracy. The Japanese formation was holding a perfect escort pattern. One destroyer leading, 3 transports behind, and another destroyer guarding the rear. It was textbook doctrine. "Sir," Briggs said, "their lead ship is turning slightly again. Another zigzag." "They're trying to shake us," Rourke replied. "They don't know we're not using eyesight." He communicated the change to the bridge. This time the response came instantly. "Maintain pursuit. Combat will direct." Rourke understood what that meant. The captain had placed full trust in the radar team. In this fog, the CIC was effectively steering the ship. As the Farragut continued forward, the tension in the CIC grew sharper. No one spoke unless necessary. Every man felt the weight of the situation. If the radar picture failed, they would be advancing blind into enemy waters. But the equipment remained steady. Briggs finally whispered, almost to himself, "Sir, they really don't know we're here." Rourke placed a hand on the young ensign's shoulder. "Exactly, and that's our advantage." The destroyer moved deeper into the fog, closing the distance with a formation that still believed the night was theirs. But the night no longer belonged to darkness. It belonged to the men watching a glowing radar screen and guiding a ship toward an enemy that could not see them coming. The USS Farragut pushed steadily through the fog as the night grew colder and the sea settled into a slow, rolling rhythm. The ship's bow cut through the water without any visible reference point ahead. Lookouts scanned the blank white curtain around them, but saw nothing except their own breath drifting in the air. Every man topside felt the same unease. They were moving forward without eyes. Only the crew deep inside the ship understood what they were closing in on. Inside the Combat Information Center, the radar sweeps continued in exact intervals. Walter Briggs kept one hand on the gain control and the other on his pencil, ready to update the plot the moment Rourke requested it. The green screen in front of him glowed softly in the dim space. The rotating line traced the darkness again and again, revealing shapes that no lookout could ever hope to see under these conditions. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Rourke stood close by, reviewing the plot table where positions were marked with small plastic indicators. Each one represented a ship detected by radar. The Japanese formation had become clearer over the last 12 minutes. The lead destroyer held a consistent zigzag pattern, likely part of their standard evasion routine. The transports remained tight behind it. The trailing destroyer kept a wider arc in the rear, a position normally used to detect pursuing forces. On the Shiritsu, Captain Nakagawa maintained course with confidence. He checked the compass, the engine telegraphs, and the faint sound of the sea. He believed the Americans, if they were even searching this far west, would never risk moving at speed through such heavy fog. His formation followed tightly behind him, trusting that he was guiding them safely through the night. The sailors on the transports below deck had no idea how close American forces truly were. Lieutenant Sato continued to monitor the chart table, updating their estimated position. He calculated drift from wind direction, estimated speed based on throttle changes, and adjusted the projected track every few minutes. He took his work seriously, knowing that even a slight miscalculation in these waters could place them on a collision course with reefs or enemy patrols. The fog made him uneasy, not because it limited visibility, but because it amplified unknowns. He had seen American tactics evolve in recent months. Something about their night movements had changed, and radar was always at the center of the reports. Back on the Farragut, Briggs' voice broke the silence in the CIC. "Sir, targets are altering course again. Another bearing change, 2 degrees starboard." Rourke examined the sweep and nodded. "They're tightening their zigzag. They must think they're entering open water." He delivered the update to the bridge through the intercom. The destroyer adjusted course accordingly. Engine noise increased as speed climbed. The momentum pushed crew members slightly off balance before they corrected themselves. Everyone on board understood they were closing in. Minutes passed. The tension inside the CIC became heavier. No one raised their voice. No one wasted a movement. Briggs tracked the formation with growing focus, aware that any mistake could send the Farragut into danger. Rourke double-checked range and bearing before delivering each correction to the bridge. He understood that the captain relied entirely on the information he provided. At the same time, Japanese officers aboard Shiritsu continued to believe they were safe. No lookouts reported anything unusual. No engine noises echoed through the fog. The transports sent no alerts. The formation appeared to be moving undetected through the night. Captain Nakagawa stepped outside the bridge again and listened carefully. The only sound was the slow drop of moisture hitting the deck and the steady beat of the engines. To him, it was confirmation that the fog shielded them completely. But inside the Farragut, Rourke and Briggs were watching the Japanese formation turn, drift, and adjust speed with a clarity that felt almost unnatural given the conditions. The SG radar reduced the entire ocean to precise coordinates and movements. What the Japanese officers believed was uncertainty was, to the Americans, clear and measurable. Briggs leaned closer to the scope and reported the next update. "Sir, we're closing fast. Range to the closest contact, 16,000 yards." Rourke checked the plot. The distance had been cut by more than half in the last quarter hour. He relayed the update to the bridge and waited for the next command. Moments later, the reply came through the intercom. "Maintain course. Increase speed to flank when ready." Rourke understood the meaning. The ship was entering engagement range. Radar would direct the next movements until visual contact became possible. The captain had given control of the approach to the CIC. Briggs adjusted the clarity of the radar return. The blips sharpened. The lead contact appeared solid now, firm enough to distinguish it from the transports behind it. Briggs spoke in a steady voice, but there was a tremor of excitement underneath. "Sir, that lead contact is definitely a destroyer." Rourke confirmed it with a short glance. "That's their escort. They're right where we expected." On the Japanese side of the fog, Sato's pencil stopped as he suddenly realized how long it had been since they last received a status signal from the rear escorting destroyer. He strained to hear anything beyond the muted engines, but found nothing. He considered telling the captain, but Nakagawa remained convinced they were alone. Sato kept his concerns to himself. Inside the CIC, Rourke leaned over Briggs again. "Prepare to relay targeting information. We'll be in range soon." Briggs nodded. He wiped his palms on his uniform before returning to the controls. He knew that in the next several minutes, the destroyer would depend entirely on their calculations for the opening maneuver. Outside, the fog swallowed everything, but the American destroyer surged through it with purpose. Neither side could see the other. Only one side understood that sight no longer mattered. The distance steadily decreased as the radar picture grew sharper, and the moment of first contact moved closer with every sweep of the rotating line. The distance between the two formations closed quickly, though neither side could see anything beyond the wall of fog surrounding them. The USS Farragut maintained its approach under radar guidance, adjusting course with every update from the Combat Information Center. The vibration of the engines intensified as the destroyer pushed forward at higher speed. Crew members topside could feel the ship lifting slightly with each surge of power, but they still saw nothing. No lights, no shadows, nothing to indicate that enemy ships were only minutes away. Inside the CIC, Walter Briggs tracked the lead Japanese destroyer with unwavering concentration. The blip representing the target grew larger and more distinct on the radar scope. He reported each slight change in bearing to Lieutenant Commander Rourke, who verified the information before relaying it to the bridge. The coordination between them had become seamless, a practiced rhythm that formed under pressure. Range closing. Now 4,000 yards, Briggs said quietly. Rourke looked at the plot table and compared the distances. At this range, visual contact could happen at any moment. He switched to the bridge intercom and delivered the update. The reply came back in a steady voice, but the tone carried a new tension. All stations prepare for potential sighting. Maintain radar guidance. Up on the Farragut's bridge, the captain and lookouts stood at their positions, staring into a featureless white void. The fog had thinned slightly, but not enough to reveal anything more than faint variations in brightness. The crew listened for any sound from the Japanese formation, but the ocean remained quiet. Then, for the first time that night, something changed. A faint shadow appeared ahead. At first, it seemed like another layer of fog, but it held its shape. One of the lookouts leaned forward, trying not to lose sight of it. "I've got something," he said, uncertain. "Dead ahead, low and wide." The captain stepped forward. The shadow strengthened, then faded, then returned again. He lifted his binoculars, though they provided almost no improvement at such close distance. Still, he saw enough to confirm that it was not a cloud or trick of light. He reached for the intercom. "Combat, we have a possible visual. Confirm range." Briggs responded immediately. "Range 2,000 yards and closing." The voice from the bridge answered, "Prepare for identification." On the Shiratsu, Captain Nakagawa remained unaware of how close the Americans had come. His destroyer continued forward at a steady speed, cutting through fog that had begun to lighten only slightly. He stood on the bridge wing again, analyzing the faint outline of the sea below. His officers reported consistent speed from the transports behind them, and everything appeared normal. Lieutenant Sato checked the time and their estimated position. He felt a growing sense of uncertainty, but without visual reference points, he had no evidence to justify interrupting the captain. Still, the silence behind their formation bothered him. The fog muted engine noise to almost nothing, but he expected at least a faint vibration or echo. Tonight, there was nothing. As he leaned over the chart table, a lookout shouted from the starboard side. "Shadow off the bow. Bearing 070. Nakagawa turned sharply. He rushed to the lookout position and squinted into the thinning fog. A shape emerged, slowly, almost reluctantly, like a dark silhouette pressing against the white curtain. It grew more defined with each passing second. He saw a bow, then a forward deck, then the faint outline of a bridge structure. It was not Japanese. Nakagawa's expression changed instantly. His fingers tightened on the railing. He shouted to the helmsman to prepare for evasive action, but the fog muffled his voice, forcing him to repeat the order with greater force. On the Farragut, the shadow ahead solidified into the recognizable outline of an enemy destroyer. Lookouts confirmed it out loud, one after another, as the shape fully emerged from the fog at close range. Enemy destroyer off the bow. The captain remained calm, though his eyes narrowed with focus. He had expected this moment, but the proximity still struck him. He contacted the CIC. Combat visual contact established. Confirmed target alignment. Rourke looked over Briggs' shoulder. The radar return was brighter now, more defined than at any previous point. Target exactly where radar predicted. Bearing confirmed. Ready for fire control solutions. The bridge acknowledged. Orders passed quickly to gun crews, who had been preparing quietly for the last several minutes. They could not yet see the entire enemy ship, but they saw enough. On the Shiratsu, alarms sounded across the bridge. Officers rushed to their stations, shouting updates and trying to identify the American ship through the thinning fog. Lieutenant Sato stared at the approaching silhouette and knew what it meant. Their assumption of safety had not been protection. It had been a trap. He turned to Nakagawa. "Captain," they approached without detection. "They must have been tracking us long before this." Nakagawa did not respond immediately. He watched the American destroyer grow larger, clearer, undeniable. His earlier confidence drained as he processed the implications. The Americans had moved through the fog with precision, timing, and direction that no human eye could achieve. "How did they find us?" he whispered, more to himself than to any officer. He took a step forward, as if the answer might appear somewhere within the fog around them. But the truth had already taken shape across the water. Their enemy had not relied on sight at all. Back on the Farragut, Rourke issued the final update to the bridge. Enemy destroyer directly ahead. Visual contact confirmed. Radar tracking stable. The captain responded with a steady command. "All stations stand by. Engagement imminent." Both ships pushed through the last remnants of fog, their silhouettes now fully visible to one another. The moment the Japanese believed could never happen had arrived with absolute certainty. Fog no longer protected them. Fog no longer hid them. Fog no longer mattered. Radar had guided the Americans straight to them, and the first clash of the night was seconds away. The moment visual contact was confirmed, both destroyers reacted within seconds. On the USS Farragut, the captain issued the order to bring the main battery to readiness. Gun crews who had been standing by for nearly 10 minutes locked shells into breeches and swung their weapons toward the bearing relayed from the CIC. Fog still clung to the water, but the silhouette of the Japanese destroyer was now clear enough for fire control officers to make final adjustments. Inside the Combat Information Center, Walter Briggs kept his eyes fixed on the radar scope. The lead contact, Shiratsu, had slowed slightly, possibly reacting to the sudden sighting. Briggs reported every change in speed and bearing to Lieutenant Commander Rourke, who correlated the data with the movements visible on the bridge. Radar and visual information blended into one unified picture, guiding the Americans toward a precise opening strike. "Range closing," Briggs said. 2,000 yards, 1,800, 1,600. Rourke relayed the distances without delay. He could hear the tension in the bridge officer's voice through the intercom as the ship prepared to fire. The Americans had the advantage of being ready. The Japanese had been caught in the middle of a course adjustment, and their weapons were not yet trained fully toward the threat. On the Shiratsu, the shock of the sudden encounter threw the bridge into immediate alarm. Officers shouted updates while sailors scrambled to stations. Captain Nakagawa stepped toward the forward windows and assessed the American destroyer's position. He recognized instantly that the enemy had approached with accuracy that could not have been achieved through eyesight alone. The realization struck him with a clarity that no amount of experience could ignore. "Hard to port," he ordered, raising his voice above the noise. "Prepare all forward guns." The helmsman responded instantly, spinning the wheel. The destroyer began to turn, but the maneuver came a few seconds too late. Japanese gunners attempted to rotate their weapons toward the American position, but their fire control crews struggled to get accurate bearings in the remaining fog. Rangefinders could barely make out the shape of the enemy. On the Farragut, everything moved with practice coordination. The fire control officer shouted out the final figures. The captain gave the order, "Open fire." The first American salvo erupted from the main battery, producing a sharp, heavy concussion that echoed across the water. The shells traveled only a short distance before striking the forward deck of the Shiratsu. Sparks scattered across the steel plating. Smoke rose through the fog. Japanese sailors dropped to the deck as shrapnel flew across their positions. The Japanese destroyer attempted to respond. Its forward guns fired a hasty volley, but the rounds went wide, disappearing into the fog behind the frigate. The fire control solution from the Japanese side was delayed and imprecise. Every second they spent correcting was a second the Americans used to strike again. Rourke watched the radar scope as the blip representing the enemy destroyer faltered. "Sir, they're slowing," Briggs announced. "Loss of speed, possibly engine hit." Rourke repeated the update to the bridge. He could hear urgency building above him as the ship adjusted its angle slightly, positioning itself for a clearer shot. On the Shiratsu, chaos spread across the main deck. A fire broke out near the bow where the first salvo had struck. Damage control teams rushed forward, pulling hoses and extinguishers. Lieutenant Sato clung to the chart table to keep his balance as the destroyer heeled sharply during the evasive turn. He shouted above the noise, "Captain, their targeting is too accurate. They're adjusting with every move we make." Nakagawa gripped the railing as the deck shook from another impact. He struggled to keep his voice steady. "Increase speed. Bring rear batteries to bear." But the next American salvo hit before the order could take full effect. The frigate maintained a constant firing rhythm, adjusting each shot based on fresh radar readings. Their gunners no longer needed a clear visual picture. They only needed the coordinates fed from the CIC. This allowed them to fire faster and more accurately than any Japanese destroyer could under these conditions. The Shiratsu shuddered under the force of the impacts. The forward section of the ship dipped slightly as compartments began to flood. Smoke curled through the bridge windows. Some officers coughed as the air grew thick with fumes. Below deck, Japanese engineers reported engine damage. They struggled to keep pressure up in the boilers, but one of the lines had ruptured from shock. The destroyer's speed dropped rapidly, despite efforts to correct it. Back in the CIC, Briggs made the announcement the moment he saw the radar return change shape. "Enemy destroyer losing propulsion. Range decreasing. They're nearly dead in the water." Rourke repeated it to the bridge. Across the water, Sato watched as the American destroyer maintained perfect positioning. He recognized what was happening. The Americans had turned the fog into an advantage. Their targeting was guided by technology, not sight. They saw every turn, every attempt to maneuver, every slowing of speed. Nakagawa stood at the center of the bridge, surrounded by smoke and scattered reports coming from every direction. His earlier confidence had vanished entirely. He understood now that the Americans had found them long before the fog had thinned. He looked at the enemy destroyer, its guns steady, its course unwavering, and felt the full weight of the situation. He exhaled once, slowly, and spoke to no one in particular. "They are not aiming with eyes." The frigate prepared another salvo. The Japanese ship struggled to turn, but lacked the speed to complete the maneuver. Damage control teams fought the fires with urgency, but the destroyer's nose dipped lower with each passing minute. The battle had lasted only moments, but its outcome had been shaped long before the first round was fired. Radar had removed guesswork from the American side and left the Japanese relying on instinct and doctrine that no longer matched the reality of modern warfare. As the smoke drifted across the foggy sea, the engagement reached its turning point. One destroyer remained fully operational. The other was fighting for survival. The night had shifted, and both sides understood that the advantage belonged to the ship whose crew could see without seeing. The final minutes of the engagement unfolded under a layer of fog that had begun to thin but still clung to the surface of the sea. The USS Farragut maintained its position off the starboard side of the damaged Japanese destroyer, keeping a controlled distance while gun crews prepared for a follow-up strike. The ship's engines hummed steadily, holding the vessel in place as officers on the bridge evaluated the enemy's condition. No further aggressive movement came from the Shiratsu. The destroyer drifted slowly, its bow dipping lower and its engines barely producing power. Inside the Combat Information Center, Walter Briggs monitored the radar return in silence. The bright blip representing the Japanese ship had changed shape, indicating severe loss of speed and stability. He reported the update in a steady voice, though he felt the strain of a long engagement. Lieutenant Commander Rourke stood behind him, arms crossed, studying the plot table while weighing the next steps. He recognized that the Japanese destroyer was no longer a threat, but the situation still required caution. A damaged enemy ship could fire torpedoes even when immobilized, and they were close enough that reaction time would be limited. Rourke passed the updated information to the bridge. The captain acknowledged and ordered the gunners to hold fire unless the Japanese ship attempted another turn or opened fire again. On deck, sailors stood by their weapons, watching the crippled destroyer through the thinning fog. The scene ahead was clearer now. The Shiratsu listed slightly to port, smoke rising from several sections of the forward deck. Men could be seen moving hurriedly along the rails, some carrying hoses, others attempting to clear debris. Their shouts were faint but audible, carried by the morning breeze. On the Japanese destroyer, Lieutenant Sato emerged from the smoke-filled interior and stepped onto the bridge wing. He surveyed the damage with a grim expression. The bow section had been struck multiple times. Several compartments were flooded, and the forward magazine had been evacuated as a precaution. Fires still burned near the first gun mount, though crewmen were making progress extinguishing them. He felt the ship sinking slightly with each swell, though not fast enough to threaten an immediate catastrophic loss. Captain Nakagawa remained in the center of the bridge, reviewing the latest damage reports handed to him by his officers. He listened carefully to each detail, nodding slowly. The destroyer was no longer maneuverable. Its engines responded only at minimal output. The ship's steering was sluggish, and several watertight doors had been compromised. The crew had done their best to contain the damage, but the captain knew the outcome was already decided. Even if they managed to restore partial power, the American destroyer remained positioned perfectly to dictate the next action. He moved to the forward windows and looked toward the American ship. The fog around it had thinned enough to reveal its full silhouette. He saw the crew with their guns, calm and organized. He saw no panic, no disorder. The Americans had approached with precision, fired with accuracy, and held their position with discipline. Nakagawa's earlier certainty about the fog's protection no longer held any weight. In his mind, the reason for their defeat had become unmistakably clear. Lieutenant Sato stood beside him. Without being prompted, he spoke quietly. "Radar, Captain. They must have tracked us the entire time." Nakagawa gave no immediate response. He kept his eyes fixed on the American ship, watching its steady posture on the water. The night fighting doctrine he had trained under had been built on darkness, confusion, and surprise. But the Americans had replaced these elements with a system that eliminated uncertainty entirely. Radar had made traditional tactics ineffective, and for the first time, Nakagawa acknowledged the extent of that shift. On the Farragut, Rourke received new instructions from the bridge. The captain ordered a slow approach to assess whether the Japanese ship would surrender, resist, or attempt to scuttle. Rourke relayed the information to the radar team and the plotting officers. Briggs adjusted the range markers to track both ships as the distance closed gradually. The CIC remained quiet, its crew aware that the battle itself had ended, but the situation still required vigilance. The American destroyer inched forward at minimal speed. Lookouts stood ready, watching for any sudden movement from the damaged ship. Gun crews remained alert but held their fire. The fog had now lifted enough that the first signs of dawn began to show in the distance, a pale, muted light spreading across the horizon. As the sky brightened, the true scale of the Shiratsu's damage became visible. Scorch marks covered the forward deck. The hull showed several areas where metal had buckled inward from impacts. Smoke rose from the open hatches, drifting upward in thin columns. Yet despite the destruction, crew members were still working tirelessly to stabilize the ship. Nakagawa observed the growing daylight with a calm resignation. He understood that the Americans would not attack further unless provoked. Their approach was measured and deliberate. He knew what his next steps had to be. He ordered his officers to cease all weapons activity and focus on damage control, and crew safety. There would be no final, desperate attack. The ship was no longer capable of mounting one. Meanwhile, on the Farragut, Rourke stepped out of the CIC for the first time since the engagement began. He walked onto the deck and looked toward the Japanese destroyer. The morning light revealed everything the radar had already told him. The enemy ship had lost the ability to maneuver and was struggling to stay afloat. The men aboard were no longer combatants in a fight. They were sailors trying to survive the aftermath. Briggs joined him a moment later. He had removed his headphones and carried the weight of the long night shift in his posture. He had seen the radar blip weaken, slow, and change shape, but seeing the actual ship in daylight affected him differently. "Sir," he said quietly, "it looks worse than I imagined." Rourke nodded. "War does that. Radar showed us movement. Reality shows us the cost." The two men stood in silence as the sun continued to rise. The fog thinned by the minute, revealing the surrounding ocean in soft hues of gray and gold. The battle had ended, but the implications of what had happened hung heavily over both ships. The Americans now understood that radar had given them control of the night in a way no navy had possessed before. The Japanese understood that their long-held advantage in night combat had been fundamentally overturned. As daylight spread across the sea, the last remnants of fog lifted completely. The Shiratou drifted quietly, wounded and exhausted, while the Farragut held position at a respectful distance. The battle was over, but the message of the night remained clear. The era of darkness as protection had ended, and naval warfare would never return to what it had been before that fog-filled night.